Welcome. Let's continue our discussion about if statements in Excel. The next if statement we're going to look at is what's called the nested simple if function. First of all, we'll talk about what is a nested simple if function. Then we'll talk about when you might use one. And then we'll try and understand the logic of the nested if before we move into the Excel environment and show you an example. So when do you need a nested simple if? Basically, as soon as there are more than two options, you need a nested simple if. The example here, where there's no discount for cars hired less than 7 days, a 5% discount for cars hired between 7 and 12 days, and then a 10% discount for any cars hired over 12 days. This is an example with three options, couldn't be solved with a simple if function, similar to what we've been implementing already. We need a nested simple if. In the title nested simple if, there's two elements to it. The nested part implies that there's more than one if statement. There's an if statement inside an if statement. The simple part implies that there's still only one criteria being checked. So you're still checking for the same criteria each time, which is, in this case, the length of hire of the car. So that's where the title nested simple if comes from, and that's when you're going to need it. So let's work through this example in a little more detail. Some ground rules as well with your nested if statements. The first is that the number of if statements required will always be one less than the number of options. So in the example we're working through, there's 3 options, so there'll only be 2 if statements. If there's 4 options, there'll be 3 if statements, etc. Also, when implementing the logic, remember that you're going to calculate from left to right. So first of all, you check to see if the hire is less than 7 days. Then you check to see if it's less than 12 days. And then the last option doesn't need to be checked, because by default, if it's not less than 7 and it's not less than 12, then it must be greater than 12. So it doesn't need to be checked. We'll talk about that a little bit further on the next slide and also within the Excel example itself. Finally, when entering your nested simple if statements, you should remember that your signs should all point in the same direction. In other words, you should have all less than signs or less than and equal to signs, or you should have all greater than signs or all greater than or equal to signs. You shouldn't have a nested if statement with a mixture of greater than signs and less than signs. And if you do, you need to work through your logic again, because it will have some error in it. So the logic of the nested if statement that we're looking at, the first thing we check to see is if the car is hired for less than 7 days. If it's hired for less than 7 days, then there's no discount. So your true value is 0, no discount. But your false value, what happens? Well, you need to go and check again. Is the car hired for less than 12 days this time? And then the true value for if it's less than 12 days is a 5% discount, because you've eliminated the cars that are hired for less than 7 days and you've given them no discount. So now you're taking out the cars that are between 7 and 12 days and giving them a 5% discount. And the false value then, by default then, that's going to be all cars hired for greater than 12 days. That's going to be your 10% discount. So the example that we've been talking about again, looking at the nested if simple if statement. Is the car hired for less than 7 days? Your true value is 0, no discount if it's hired for less than 7 days. Your false value is another check. Is the car hired for less than 12 days? And if it is, your true value then is a 5% discount, your false value a 10% discount. And that's the logic we're going to move into Excel with now and implement using the if dialog box. So here we have our car hire company, we have our customer names, we have the car hire details. Here's your days hired. And here's your total. Your total is just a multiplication of the days hired by your cost per day. So this is the cell that we're trying to calculate using our nested simple if. So like our other if statements, you need to put yourself in the cell where you want your answer. So we put ourselves in cell F4, and then we call up our insert function dialog. We call up our if function dialog, and we start working through the logic. So what's our first check? Well, our first check is to check the days hired. So we go and get Pat Kelly's days hired, in this case C4, and we check to see if it's less than 7 days. If it's less than 7 days, the true value is no discount, so 0. Now, if it's not less than 7 days, we need to go and check again. So in our false value, we need to write in another if statement. So we start typing our if syntax that we should have become familiar with at this stage. So if, open our bracket, and now we need to go and check again. So we go and check again. We go and get days hired again, C4, and this time we're checking to see if they're less than 12 days. So that's our condition, C4 less than 12. We put in our comma, and if that's true, then there's a 5% discount. So we go and get our total, and we multiply it by 5%. Put in our comma, that's the end of our true value, and our false value is a 10% discount. So we go and get our total again, and we multiply it by 10%. And that is a nested if statement. So our first test is to see if it's less than 7 days. If it's less than 7 days, no discount. Then we need to go and check again. So we say if, our condition is if it's less than 12 days, comma, 5% discount, comma, 10% discount, close the bracket. And we hit OK on that. And in the case of Pat Kelly, there's no discount as you'd expect because it's a 2-day hire. We drag down the formula and we see correctly here there's a 5% discount for the 8-day hire here, and there's a 10% discount for the 14-day hire here. So that's our formula working very nicely, and our amount due then can be simply calculated by your total minus your discount and dragging that down to the other cells. So your nested simple if function is shown to you there. When you click in the cell, you'll see it's an if statement. There's your first if statement. Within an if statement, there's your second if statement. And as I said, the number of if statements is always going to be one less than the number of options. So we had 3 options here. We had a 0 discount, a 5% discount, and a 10% discount. So we have 2 if statements. Another thing to say is at the end of a nested if statement, you'll always have the same number of brackets, closing brackets, as you do if statements. So here we have 2 ifs, so we have 2 closing brackets. If there were 3 ifs, there'd be 3 closing brackets at the end of my if statement. So thank you for your attention, and we'll move on to some other examples of the nested simple if.